There is a particular kind of quiet that falls over a place when someone says something they believed was private and discovers it was not. It is not a loud quiet. It is the kind that spreads slowly like ink in water, touching everything nearby before most people have even noticed. It has begun that quiet fell over the dairy aisle of Harrington's grocery on a Wednesday afternoon in October, and the person who caused it was not who anyone would have expected. But we will get to that first. You need to know about Daniel Voss. Daniel was 42 years old, dark-haired, broad through the chest and shoulders in the way of a man who had spent his 20s doing physical work and had simply stayed that way. He was not a man who took up much conversational space. He was the kind of man who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things without announcing that he had noticed them, who carried a particular steadiness that people sometimes mistook for slowness until they spent enough time around him to understand it was something else entirely. He worked as a high school history teacher. He had been doing it for 14 years, and he was good at it in the way that the best teachers are good, not by making the subject easy, but by making students understand why it mattered. His daughter was Rosie. She was 9 years old, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's habit of watching the world carefully, before deciding what she thought about it. Rosie's mother had passed away from an illness 3 years ago, and since then it had been just the two of them. Daniel and Rosie against the ordinary requirements of daily life, which is to say, grocery runs and school pickups and Saturday morning pancakes, and the particular negotiations that happen between a grown man and a 9-year-old girl about what goes into the shopping cart today. The negotiation was about a box of chocolate granola bars. Rosie had placed it in the cart with the quiet confidence of someone who has already decided the matter is settled. Daniel had picked it up and looked at the sugar content and set it back on the shelf. Rosie had looked at him. He had looked at her. The negotiation was ongoing. They were in the middle of it, Rosie now holding the box and making a series of reasonable arguments that Daniel was pretending to find less convincing than he actually did. When the woman arrived in the aisle, she was somewhere in her mid-40s, impeccably dressed in white, blonde hair swept up in an elaborate arrangement that must have taken considerable time and attention, pearl earrings, pearl necklace, a phone in one hand, and the expression of someone who has not waited for anything in a very long time. She walked to the section of the shelf, directly beside where Daniel and Rosie were standing, reached for something on the upper shelf, and found that Daniel was leaning slightly into that space, his hand on the cart. "Excuse me," he said immediately, straightening and moving the cart to give her room. She did not acknowledge this. She took what she needed from the shelf and then stood there looking at her phone, and after a moment she began to speak not to Daniel, not to Rosie, to someone on the other end of a phone call. In German, Daniel's expression did not change. He looked at Rosie, who was still making her case for the granola bars. "Rosie," he said quietly in English, "we talked about the sugar limit for the week, but—" "Papa, these have oats," Rosie said, with the confidence of someone deploying a clinching argument. The woman on the phone beside them continued speaking in German, her voice low but not particularly quiet, and what she was saying, in German, was this: she was telling whoever was on the phone that she was stuck in the cereal aisle, next to a man in a cheap red shirt and a child who clearly had no concept of nutrition, and that the quality of people one encountered in ordinary grocery stores was frankly something she found exhausting, and that she could not understand why a man of that size did not spend less time in the granola aisle and more time doing something productive, and that the child's fashion sense was about what you would expect. She said all of this with the fluent ease of someone who had spoken this way about people standing nearby for many years without consequence, because in her experience, most people standing nearby did not speak German. The young woman behind them in the green store uniform, a clerk named May, who had been quietly stocking the nearby shelves, looked uncomfortable in the way of someone who is witnessing something they cannot quite intervene, and Rosie was still talking about oats. Daniel listened to his daughter for a moment. Then he set the granola bars gently back in the cart. He looked at them. He picked them up again, and then, in perfectly clear, unhurried German, with the particular accent of someone who learned the language in southern Germany and had been speaking it for a long time, he said, You know, the oats argument is actually fairly sound from a nutritional standpoint. The fiber content does offset the sugar. Somewhat, the woman's phone call stopped. Not gradually, it stopped the way a radio stops when you pull the plug. Instantly and completely, she turned and looked at Daniel. He was reading the back of the granola bar box with the mild, interested expression of a man who has just learned something useful about breakfast food. He did not look at her. Rosie, still not fully tracking the adult situation unfolding above her head, said, "See, Papa, I told you." Daniel nodded slowly, still in German. "She makes a reasonable case." Then he set the box in the cart and looked up. He looked at the woman directly. Now his expression was entirely pleasant. He said, still in German, and still in that unhurried way, "I hope your call goes well?" The woman's face had gone through several colors in the preceding 15 seconds. She was currently somewhere between deep rose and pale. She was clearly a person who was very rarely caught at a disadvantage and had not developed a great deal of practical experience with what to do when it happened. She said in English now with a slight accent. "You speak German," he said. "I do." He switched back to English without making a production of it. "I studied in Munich for 2 years, and I have been teaching European history for 14 years. It comes up more often than you might think." There was a silence. May, the store clerk, had stopped pretending to stock the shelves and was watching with the focused attention of someone who does not want to miss how this ends. Rosie looked between her father and the woman, and then back at her father with the expression of someone who has just understood that a whole conversation happened that she was not fully part of. The woman straightened. She was the kind of person who had not built whatever she had built by being incapable of recovery. She looked at Daniel. She said, "That was," her voice paused, "not my finest moment," he said. "We all have them." She looked at Rosie. Rosie looked back at her with those steady auburn-haired eyes, still holding the granola box. The full picture of a child who is processing. The woman said to Rosie, "You argued your case very well." Rosie said, "I know." Daniel put his hand briefly over his eyes. The woman almost smiled. It arrived at the corner of her mouth and then pulled back, but it had been there. She said to Daniel, "You did not say anything while I was speaking." He said, "You were on a phone call. It was not my place to interrupt." She looked at him. He looked at her. She said, "You could have said something much sooner." He said, "Yes." She waited for more. He said, "But what would have been the point of that? The point was that you heard yourself, not that I corrected you. There is a difference." She was quiet for a moment that had some real weight in it. Then she said, "My name is Ingrid Hartman." He said, "Daniel Voss." He nodded at Rosie. "This is Rosie." Ingrid looked at Rosie. She said, "Are you always this persistent about breakfast food?" Rosie said, "Papa says I am persistent about most things," Ingrid said. "That is usually either a very good quality or a very exhausting one." Rosie considered this seriously. "Probably both," she said. Ingrid looked at Daniel. He had the mild expression of a man who has heard this assessment of his daughter before and has made his peace with it. Ingrid said, "Are you actually a history teacher?" he said. "Yes," she said. "At which school?" He told her. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "I went to a school very like that one when I was growing up in Munich." He said, "Good school," she said. "It was the teachers there," she paused, "were mostly people who cared whether you learned anything," he said. "That is the job." She looked at him for a moment, in a way that was different from the way she had been looking at anything in this aisle since she walked into it. With less of the surface and more of the actual person behind it, she said, "I owe you an apology," he said. "You do not owe me anything," she said. "I am going to give you one anyway." She said it clearly and without performance, a practical woman applying a practical correction. She said, "What I said was unkind and it was wrong, and I am sorry." He nodded. Once he said, "I appreciate that." She looked at Rosie again. She said, "And you? Your father is a patient man." Rosie said, "I know he says patience is a superpower." Ingrid said, "He is right." There was a pause. May had resumed stocking the shelves with the careful focus of someone who is trying very hard to look like they were never watching anything. Ingrid looked at her phone. She looked at the shelf. She looked back at Daniel. She said, "I have a question, and you can absolutely tell me it is none of my business." He waited. She said, "You teach European history, you speak German, you spent 2 years in Munich. What are you doing in a grocery store in this city, arguing about granola bars on a Wednesday afternoon?" He said, "I live here, my daughter goes to school here on Wednesdays, we do the grocery run together." He said it simply, the way you state a fact about something that is not complicated. Ingrid looked at Rosie in the cart, still holding the granola box. She looked at Daniel. She said, "That is actually," she stopped. She started again. She said, "My father used to take me grocery shopping on Wednesdays when I was small. I had completely forgotten that until just now." She said it in a way that was not performing nostalgia, but genuinely surprised by it, the way memory sometimes surfaces without asking permission. Daniel said, quietly, "Those are good memories to have." She nodded. She did not say anything for a moment. Then she straightened in the way of someone returning to the present from somewhere briefly else. She said, "I will let you finish your shopping," he said. "Take care of yourself." She looked at him one more time with those sharp, complicated eyes. She said, "You as well, Daniel Voss." She walked away down the aisle. Rosie watched her go. Then she looked up at her father. She said, "Papa." What was she saying on the phone before he said something she should not have said? Rosie thought about this. Was she sorry? He said, "Yes, I think genuinely." Rosie turned the granola box over in her hands. "Is that enough?" she said, "just being sorry." He crouched down so he was at her level. He said, "It is a start. Real sorry means you try not to do it again. That part takes longer than one afternoon to know." Rosie looked at the box. Then she looked at him. She said, "Can we get the granola bars?" He said, "Yes." She put them in the cart with the satisfaction of someone who has won a fair argument. They finished their shopping, and they went to the checkout, and they drove home through the October afternoon, the trees along the road doing what they do in October, turning every color at once before they let go. Rosie fell asleep in the back seat around the corner from home. Daniel drove the last few blocks slowly. He thought about what his own father had said to him once years ago when Daniel was young and someone had been unkind, and he had asked his father why people talked about each other that way. His father had said, "Most people are fighting something you cannot see, and sometimes it comes out sideways." He had paused. Then he said, "Your job is to decide whether to hand it back to them or to put it down." Daniel had been 11 years old. He had not fully understood it. Then he understood it. Now he pulled into the driveway. He sat for a moment in the quiet car, his daughter asleep behind him. Then he got out, and he got the groceries, and he went inside, and that was Wednesday. Ordinary and not ordinary, the way most of the important days are. If this story stayed with you, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one, and leave a comment below. Tell us about a moment when you chose to put something down instead of handing it back. We read every single one.